but there was no number which actually said 169, because 69 has a sexual connotation. Why would somebody, where there's not a number mentioned at all in any of the data sets, it is a very deliberate way of trying to smear the name of His Holiness by using a cognitive warfare.
In his now, 70 years of leadership, China has been constantly trying to sling mud and attack the Dalai Lama.
Can the CCP ever defeat the Tibetan movement on truthful moral grounds, or do they have to keep making things up?
I think they have to keep making things up.
This is Tibet Unfiltered. Real stories, real Tibet. Unfiltered conversations, eyewitness accounts, and deep dive investigations that challenge the Chinese Communist Party's narrative on Tibet. I'm your host, Geraldine Nordfeldt. I'm a former journalist and board member of the Australia-Tibet Council, with production by Sonam Gyaltsen. As the Dalai Lama said, in our struggle for freedom, truth is the only weapon we possess.
China and the Epstein files, what do they have to do with each other? And how are His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan movement being defamed and smeared in the mess? If you've been online in recent weeks, the ugly, disgusting fallout from the revelations in the Epstein files need no further explanation. The evidence is disturbing, enraging, and emotions are high. The perfect storm for malicious actors to smear by association. The Chinese Communist Party runs a sophisticated propaganda and information warfare system using digital surveillance, AI content, and platform manipulation, and Tibetans, especially the Dalai Lama, are the targets. Here are the facts. His Holiness the Dalai Lama's name is mentioned, appearing in mass-distributed newsletters, administrative contact lists, or discussions with third parties about potential ways to connect, without evidence of actual contact, financial ties, or awareness on the Dalai Lama's part. Many of the references are actually duplicates. His Holiness and his office and representatives never engaged with or met Epstein. This was verified in a recent official press statement. But another statement circulated widely online, forged and edited on identical official letterhead and posted from a Facebook and X page titled Free Tibet Movement, with untrue claims of repeated contact. And this comes after the 2023 release of an edited video of His Holiness, which also went viral globally, with very little context from the Tibetan cultural perspective. Joining us now to help us tell fact from fiction from the Tibetan settlements in India, Lobsang Gyatso Sitha, and in Sydney, Australia, Dr. Zoe Bedford. Lobsang is currently the Director of Technology at the Tibet Action Institute and a member of the 17th Tibetan Parliament in Exile. And Dr. Bedford is the Executive Officer of the Australia-Tibet Council. Welcome to Tibet Unfiltered. Is the timing of this coincidental, coming after winning his first Grammy Award for his album, Meditations, the Reflections of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, with teachings on compassion and mindfulness, or are we seeing a deliberate digital attack?
Thank you so much for having me, Geraldine. And I think I'm not going to go into details because I think you've already stated in your intro kind of like what the files are about. But just to reiterate maybe one or two things, out of the 160 something odd references to His Holiness in the Epstein files, I think about 70%, if you look at the numbers. And this was the research that was done by two groups. One was done by the TCRC, which is the technical wing of the Central Tibetan Administration or the Tibetan government in exile. And there was also a group of Tibetan researchers who actually analyzed all the mentions of His Holiness in the Epstein files. And based on their data and their research, they actually found about 50% of the mentions were actually media, spam, list, name drop. And about 20% were newsletter, articles, and dossier. And the rest, which were 30%, which is about emails, but it's only referencing His Holiness in terms of context and nothing to do with actual communication. So with that being said, I think one thing that I wanted to highlight and why I think this is a deliberate digital attack, because it is one thing that I think it's a conversation that happened with my wife, just to give you a bit of background, right? So when this happened, and I was looking at the Russia Times Russian tweet, right? And it actually said more than 169 times. And I was actually looking at the Epstein files and the data set, right? If you look at the data set, there was about 166 mentions of the Dalai Lama or 154. So there was a lot of different numbers, but there was no number which actually said 169. So then it made me think about what reference, right? So then kind of thinking about how China actually employs cognitive warfare, because 69 has a sexual connotation. So why would somebody where there's not a number mentioned at all in any of the data sets, you can search the data set, the number 169 is not there at all. So it is a very deliberate way of trying to smear the name of His Holiness by using a cognitive warfare. And I think this is a very typical case of cognitive warfare where you're trying to portray something which is not there. So I think this is how I feel like, as you said, it is a deliberate attack, and how the first tweet, right, which came out on 2nd February, which was right after, one day after His Holiness received the Grammy Awards for spoken word, right? And in cognitive warfare, it's always about who does it, how it's presented, right? So this is my perception, because I do feel like, based on all the historical data and how China uses cognitive warfare, it is about that process, right? Like first the tweet, then like CGTN on February 5th, kind of retweeting it. And like the media cycle picking up that number again and again without actually doing the data. So I do feel like this is a very deliberate digital attack, and it's using various forms of cognitive warfare so that it can kind of like make people think about what this means. Even if you're not looking at the data, you just look at the title and then it makes you think about something else. And so I think, yeah, this is a very deliberate attack.
It shouldn't be surprising to the audience to know that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is subject to attacks constantly, from China. And, just to make the point that in his now, 70 years of leadership, he's been in the public life since he was a child, since he was 2 years old and first recognized as the Dalai Lama. China has been constantly trying to sling mud and attack the Dalai Lama on various things. And so I think it's really just important that this is just seen as one in a long line of attacks, in various ways, through social media, through other digital formats, but also they do it publicly and through their media, their formal media and stuff as well. So I just think this should just be seen as one of another in a long line of attacks that His Holiness has had to endure, and make that point.
Look, the Epstein files are having global ramifications, and the revelations are still coming out, with many high-profile, powerful men being linked. Why would the CCP want to connect His Holiness to this scandal?
So, in my opinion, I think one thing is like, for the CCP, it's always about trying to connect His Holiness to something, right? And nothing has ever sticked. So, for example, if you go into the 1960s, 70s, 80s, or 90s, like the split is kind of like the feudal system. There's so many things that they have tried to do, and it has never really stuck to His Holiness, right? And the Tibetan movement. So I think now they're looking for things that they can try to portray, right? For example, like, as you said, like the 2023, like misrepresentation, the edited video, like taking the cultural context out of context, all of those things, and the recent Epstein files, because and the reality is the Epstein file contained a lot of seriously like high powerful individuals who have actually misused power, manipulated like media, manipulated so many different things, right? So it is easy to, and this is, I think, is also part of how there's so much redactions, there's so much unknown. So it's very easy to kind of like portray, maybe even if you look at the files, they're like, there's something there, even though there's nothing there. So it's kind of like conjecture, right? So I think this is a very deliberate attack. And at the same time, conjecture also sticks, right? Like, because conjecture is something that you can use. And this is something, I think this is something that the CCP has learned to actually do, especially with regards to His Holiness, is like, how can you link him to something that's is very pertinent to the world right now, something that people really care about, and make sure that like you could put as much mud as possible. And I think the reality is, because it's a social media age, right? And traditionally, like if you look at media houses, they would never publish anything like that without proof, any of that. However, because of the social media age, because of so many bloggers, so many kind of like so-called journalists, right? Like there's so many of those that kind of do it in this way, and it spreads because they are influencers, they have an audience, and so it's not really structured in the traditional way that, like, for example, if you look at like traditional media, they have restrictions, they have integrity, they have journalist standards that have to be followed. So none of those are being followed, right? So I think the social media age allows you to do this. And so the Chinese CCP has actually been able to figure out how to use the social media age, and especially the openness of the Western democracies, to really hone in their disinformation and misinformation kind of campaigns and tactics.
Yeah, I guess in an age of like clickbait headlines where people often don't even get it into the heart of the story, don't actually maybe even read the story, hear the story, then this would be an easy way to make and frame a target. It was clear that Epstein wanted to have, you know, some kind of proximity to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but that never eventuated. And I think what's interesting also is that he also talked about, you know, other great leaders like Gandhi and other people were mentioned and many times as well, you know. And so I think that those sorts of things are interesting. What I do think is a really, really good point you made there, Lobsang, is that this kind of things actually dilutes some of the important facts that are in the Epstein files. You know, I feel very strongly about the victims, you know, getting justice and holding the people who are actually the perpetrators to account. And I guess it kind of, in a way, even suits them to have the conversation move on to other people who were just, you know, named because Jeffrey Epstein wanted to go and see them or meet them or whatever, like, and say, oh, look, you know, almost like, oh, everybody's named in the Epstein files at some point, you know. And so I feel like, in a way, it's doing a real disservice. Obviously, what we're concerned about here and speaking about here is the disservice to the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan struggle, but also just to the victims of Jeffrey Epstein and all the other perpetrators too. And I think that's worth mentioning as well, how horrible that is.
A recent article in the Diplomat magazine titled "The Epstein Files and China's Information War Against the Dalai Lama" states, in an information environment saturated with competing narratives, proximity becomes suspicion and repetition becomes memory. And over time, doubt itself becomes the outcome. And this latest false allegation could be seen as damaging because of the global outrage after the 2023 viral video, where that culturally specific Tibetan gesture was detached from its context and reframed online as inappropriate conduct. Is the aim here to erode the Tibetan movement's moral authority through sustained association with manufactured controversy?
Yeah, I think in some ways it is about like reducing, I think it's about basically kind of like trying to push a different narrative. And with this day and age, I think one thing is like, and this is kind of like CCP tactic 101 in some ways, because like if you look at the traditional way, they've always talked about Tibet being part of China. And so it's like this lie repeated over and over and over again. So similar to what happened with this is like taking the context out of it, right? Like, and maybe like, as I was saying earlier, about talking about Tibet as a feudal state, not talking about the context, not talking about what age, day, time, the different aspects of how Tibet was governed at that time, right? So trying to take everything out of context is really a good strategy, because if you really want to hone in on a narrative. So I think with this day and age, I think it's all about narratives, right? So whether it's the Tibetan freedom struggle, whether it's about His Holiness, there is a lot of different narratives. And China is really playing up its narratives in terms of how it's able to really kind of show a different narrative of the Tibetan struggle or of His Holiness, right? Because if you look at it, as we were talking about earlier, right, at 90, His Holiness received a Grammy Award for spoken word, right? And his message of compassion, love, kindness is something that's resonating around the world, is something that people feel like is the need of the times, right? So how do you change that narrative? Then you change the narrative by trying to link His Holiness to something that is despicable. So I think stuff like this is something a strategic way to do this. And I don't think it's working in the way that they want it to work. However, because social media is so huge and people don't, as I think Dr. Zoe said earlier, people don't read everything. It's clickbait. They just look at the title and they don't even like read the article, and then like the perception and this whole thing about like cognitive warfare, where they are like trying to change the perception of somebody, even if you think this is not true. And even if you know this is not true, and if somebody who's just looking at the clickbait knows that this might not be true, like without reading the article, they'll continue to be like, maybe there's something. So I think this whole perspective or perception game that they're playing is something that they're trying to do. But I'm not sure, like honestly, that this will be able to change everything, because social media is very fickle, right? It stays and it goes, it moves on to the next one. So in some ways, I don't think that this is something that is going to erode Tibetan movement's moral authority. However, it is a bit of a bump on the road, I think, in some ways.
If anything, it should erode the moral authority of China. I mean, I just hope that people understand, the role that China is playing here and what is behind this messaging and what's going out, and how they are trying to tarnish the reputation of a man who has dedicated his entire life, to peace, nonviolence, compassion, to interfaith harmony, to all these things that actually progress humanity and humankind. And I think if anything, it should further erode their moral authority, that they have none. It's completely bankrupt, of course, that they would go after this. So yeah, good point.
As His Holiness gets older, and he's 90 and will gradually retreat from public life, is his legacy at risk in this digital age?
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't think his legacy is at risk, honestly, because I think Dr. Zoe already mentioned. I think one of the things about His Holiness is his message of peace, compassion, interfaith harmony. All of that is something that resonates with everyone. And the Grammy Award, as I said earlier, again, is a bit repetitive, but it is the reality. It is what people are looking for, and it is something that really shows the contribution of His Holiness to the world, in a sense, right? It's not only for the Tibetan movement, or not only for, from our own perspective, our community, our leadership, our culture, our religion, all of that, we owe so much to His Holiness. But if you look at the globe, I think there's so much of His Holiness' message of peace and compassion that is resonating with everyone. And that is one of his largest contributions to the world, right? And even if you look at His Holiness' four principal commitments, one of the most important commitments is about the world and the compassion, all of that, right? So I don't really see that it is going to be eroded, or whether his legacy is at risk. But at the same time, I think this is also about where we Tibetans also need to be, and like Tibet supporters need to be more proactive and really kind of like put facts out over fiction. So something like, when something like this is coming out, when kind of like this misinformation to malign the name of His Holiness is being promoted, or like being propagated by the CCP and its allies, then we need to actually come out with the facts. And then we also need to engage with people who are sharing it, right? So one of the things that I actually think about is, like, there are two different groups of people who are doing this, right? One, that are CCP linked influencers that are doing it on purpose. They're doing this to malign His Holiness. They're doing to malign his image, malign the Tibetan movement, the Tibetan culture, all of that, right? But then there are others who are, as you said, because it's a clickbait, they're not reading everything. So it's our duty to inform them, to educate them on what the reality is. So I think that's part of that. And so that's how we also protect his legacy, even though I don't think it is at stake. But it's also about making sure that even those who don't know what's going on, we should be able to educate them.
Can the CCP ever defeat the Tibetan movement on truthful moral grounds, or do they have to keep making things up?
I think they have to keep making things up for sure. So I mean, like, this is like, I think, I mean, like, I don't want to go into detail. I don't think we need to go into detail, but I think they just have to make stuff up, right? Because if you look at like the situation inside Tibet, if you look at the boarding schools, like colonial boarding schools that they have set up, kind of removing Tibetan language, Tibetan culture from a really young kid to be brought up, or even the whole structure of like where it's all about assimilation. So I think they have to do all of this, right? So I think they don't really have any moral high ground. So to actually showcase Tibet in a different way, they have to change the narrative. They have to talk about, I don't know, whatever they want to talk about, but like whether it's economics, whether it's about anything else, like basically kind of making sure that they can malign not only His Holiness, but also the Tibetan government in exile, the exile leadership. So I think that's part of their strategy, because they don't really have any high grounds to stand on, right?
So these digital attacks mark a shift in the CCP's communication tactics from defensive control of domestic narratives through traditional media to active attacks on Tibetan legitimacy in global digital spaces. From that Diplomat article again, The significance lies not in the documents themselves, but in how authoritarian actors exploit the openness of democratic information systems to convert trivial associations into lasting suspicion. If such campaigns go unrecognised, manufactured controversy, not evidence, will continue to shape international perceptions of human rights, cultural identity, and political legitimacy. In that context, can you tell us a bit more about how systematic the Chinese government's propaganda campaigns are?
So I think one thing is like if you look at like the campaigns, right? Like so it's very hard to see how systematic the campaigns are from the front end. And we do have some information, right? So for example, Meta, Facebook, Instagram, they actually release something called a quarterly threat intelligence report. So every 3 months they release a report which actually looks at like disinformation campaign, targeted government campaigns on how to basically change the narrative or shift the conversations. And they've actually come up with 3 different reports, like linking the CCP to attacks against the Tibetan community, the attacks against His Holiness. And this is also, I feel like, it's like the tip of the iceberg, because they, like, the first report that I saw them came up was like in, I think it was Q4 2023, where they actually linked a few accounts which were actually targeting, which was basically trying to control the narrative around Tibet, China, India, and trying to, and similar with what we talked about, the 2023, kind of like taking culturally, misrepresenting the culture and cultural context out of context. So that was something that was also done there, where there were actually like Chinese state-sponsored accounts that were actually promoting it, creating conflicts. Similarly, like I think there was one in 2024 where it was also about a few different accounts. And what was interesting was these campaigns, some of those campaigns were like, there would be one person who would actually be supporting His Holiness, another account, same a group would be against His Holiness. So they would actually manufacture content. So because like if you don't get engagement, people don't respond. So they would actually not only just be doing disinformation and attacking, they would also sometimes create a conversation, because then you want people to engage. So you're bringing people in. So I think this is something that has always been part of the strategy. And because China doesn't really like allow Tibetans to use Facebook, social media, all of those like the global forms that we have, but they are able to use the ones that we are using, right? So they're able to use this in a way to target us. At the same time, if you look at like, and for example, like in the recent like Tibetan elections, right? And I saw a number of posts, and personally, I kind of like there were like a few posts that were saying something about me personally, and like nothing bad about it, whatever. Like they were just making certain comments. And I could see that all these accounts were fake accounts. None of them were real accounts. And then there was a conversations which were being was not about the campaign, was not about individual, was not about me, but it was about trying to create a narrative about something else. So I see that this is something that's not just happening to me, it's happening on the Tibetan like ecosystem of like social media, where there's so many of these fake accounts, not just like sharing disinformation or not just kind of creating conflict, but actually generating engagement. So actually trying to create conflict by making conversations happen and bringing people in. So I think this is also kind of part of the strategy, right? And this is one of the things, but we can talk more about others, but like this is one of the strategies, I think.
Yeah, I think this is a strategy that they've had for quite a while. And we've known in the Tibet, in, Straight Tibet Council and other organizations in the movement as well, that, China has had these, paid actors, which have had the nicknames of 50 Cent Army or the White Wolves, etc. And in a way, I can imagine with bots and AI, etc., that it's even going to get even worse. And of course, the concern for us as the Australia Tibet Council is that we're outnumbered here. They've got this massive sort of machinery that they create and can fund and put money towards that can spread this misinformation or whatever China's propaganda push is at the time in huge numbers, and so not only are Tibetans, outnumbered physically, being there's sort of around 7 million Tibetans in Tibet and, the huge population of China, but we're also outnumbered in the digital world as well, and they know that they have, the money, and they can put the money into, getting people to be these low paid actors, whose job it is to go online and spread misinformation, or even, as I said, increasingly it's going to be, AI and bots that we're going to be battling it out with in the social media space. So yeah, discerning truth from fiction is going to become harder and harder.
Yeah, and I just
Absolutely.
want to add one thing on top of that. And I think one thing that has happened in the recent 1 or 2 years is social media companies have actually stopped taking responsibilities a lot more. If you look at like the historical, like maybe 5, 6 years ago, there used to be all these like uh policies that were around misinformation, disinformation, fact checking. There used to be like different councils which would do a lot of that, and but it has become more and more harder because a lot of the social media companies are US based and US owned, and the way that they have been talking about misinformation and disinformation has changed a bit. At the same time, like traditionally, if you do report, there's always a higher chance if like multiple people report on a fake account or a fake news, there's this. However, I've noticed that this is something that's going down because it's also like there used to be this whole thing about like safety and like security, kind of like groups within Meta and all of those. A lot of those have been disbanded. So it's also a general challenge, not just for Tibetans, but for the global audience, because this is something that is being levied, or social media is being used by a number of state actors. It's not just China. But the question is like, how do you do this, right? And how do you make all these social media companies more accountable? For example, like the one that I was talking about in Meta, right? The threat report. A lot of those reports were focusing on English. But like for me, I do feel like a lot of the disinformation campaigns are being run in the Tibetan space in Tibetan. So who's taking a look at that? And they won't share the data with us, because if they share the data, then we can actually take a look at it and like really look at the campaigns. But because the data is in the back end, if they don't have any Tibetan specific like team to actually look at this campaigns, it's going to be much harder to look at, right? So I think those are some of the things that I think is also a problem on this on the technology side as well.
So despite Tibetan language not being able to be taught inside Tibetan schools in Tibet, you're saying that there is still misinformation that is coming out in Tibetan language outside of Tibet to confuse the diaspora community and to spread misinformation.
Yes. And like if you look at the AI, right, and the Chinese government has spent a lot of money on AI, like especially if you look at like voice to text, they were one of the first, like the CCP supported like groups were the first ones to actually have the technology to transcribe Tibetan voice to text in all dialects. So they've actually spent a lot of money on a lot of those technologies as a means of surveillance and censorship, not as a means of promotion of the language. So it's a very different way of how they think of technology as compared to how we want these technologies to help us to maintain our culture, our language, and preserve it, right? For them, it's about how do you use these to control and like, yeah.
The irony about thinking of how that technology could be used for good as opposed to its current purpose. That's such a shame. What is the purpose of the Chinese government's Tibet International Communication Center in Lhasa?
So when that news first came out, it was very interesting because it was just like really with a lot of fanfare. It was all over like the CCP linked to like public kind of like websites and all of that. And I feel like this is an intensification. Like, so for example, like this is about providing, as we talked about, is about different narratives, right? Now, if you look at social media right now, like on Facebook example, right, there are probably, like from what I've seen, there are probably about 15 to 20 different Facebook pages that are linked to CCP like supported like Facebook pages, like something like Shizang, Shizang, or Tibet Daily, stuff like that. And all of them promote content in English. So I think the purpose of this is to provide propaganda in a different narrative, right? So for example, like there's one about like where this is about targeting, maligning His Holiness, targeting the exile movement. But then there's another side to it where there's actually about promoting Tibet in a very different light. So it's kind of like sharing a different narrative of how Tibet is. So if you look at a lot of these Facebook pages, it is not at all about targeting the exile movement or His Holiness or any of that. It presents a very different picture. It presents Tibet in the light that they want to present it in. So, for example, it will present a cultural show, it will present a concert, it will present a new boutique. So it's all about presenting Tibet in the way that they want to present, and they're using global social medias to do it. And it is all in English. So it is not trying to target Tibetans inside Tibet. It's not trying to target Chinese. It's trying to target like Tibetans in the diaspora, as well as like the global audience, on like talking about how this is the real Tibet, right? Very similar to how like a lot of like Chinese, Western Chinese influencers have always been like, look at China. China is living in 2030, 2040, 2060, and the world is still living in this. Look at the roads. So it's all about that comparison, but even not even doing comparison, but just showing so many different elements and kind of like highlighting the word Shizang, right? Like, so for example, if you, the whole debate about the conversation about how China wanted to remove the word Tibet from the global narrative, right? But if you look at all these Facebook pages, they will always use Shizang. So they'll always try to promote. So it's all about changing the narrative.
And Shizang is the Xing, that the alternative, the Chinese word for Tibet, the rebranding of Tibet.
Yes.
What can people who support Tibetans and the Tibetan movement do when they see content like we've seen in recent weeks online? What should they do?
So I think with content like this, I think there's two parts of it, right? Because you're seeing it on social media, right? And I think the first thing is to report those content. And even though I said earlier that like social media have not been as responsive, but we still have to report those because it is part of the process. And the more you report, the higher the chain it goes. So I think we have to report that. The second part is actually, I think, stop making friends, accepting friends from fake accounts, because it really reduces their impact as well as their reach. And then you can also block all these fake accounts so that like they cannot comment on your page, they cannot engage with you, because if you stop their engagement, that actually reduces their impact. So I think those are few things that you can do to kind of really make sure that like when you see content like this. And one other thing that most of us can do, or if you're part of the Tibetan movement, is basically clean up your Facebook accounts. So I've done this once or twice. Like I just go through like my Facebook accounts and just look up my friends and see like, are any of the accounts fake? Because sometimes you don't forget and you just may have accepted some friends maybe a few years ago, which is a fake account. So maybe just cleaning up your social media profiles. And because like, I think that will allow you to do this. At the same time, I think one thing is like, if it's a fake account, don't engage, delete, block, because I think that's really important, because engaging with fake accounts doesn't really help. And sometimes we feel like we can share our narrative, and not only share our narrative, but share the truth, what's happening and all of that. And you feel like they will change their viewpoint. But if it's a fake account, which is specifically meant to create engagement and actually amplify the false narratives and the malign like information, there's no point doing that. So I think that's part of it. And another one, which is like, I think if it's I did mention it a bit earlier, but if it's people who are really unaware, take the time to explain. And when you're trying to take the time to explain, have your facts. Because I think you just can't be like, you don't know what you're talking about. You actually be like, okay, this is the information that's based on this research, that research, share that with them. So you're trying to educate, right? So I think this is part of how we can do, and not only Tibetans, but Tibet supporters can do when they see stuff like this online.
Make sure you're getting your facts from the source. I mean, there's no need to, read a fake Dalai Lama news release, because there's a genuine news release on dalailama.com, and also organizations like Straight Tibet Council, Tibet Action Institute, all these things, we make sure we verify things, before we publish any kind of figures, or we put things out to our membership, or we put things out to the media. We make sure that these are verified. People do, researchers spend a lot of time verifying things about, political prisoners, their sentences, their treatments, what's happening in their lives, and in very, very difficult conditions. They work through, China's censorship and the risks that people take to verify this information. So I think people should be making sure that they get their news from legitimate sources. Like, people need to take the responsibility to do that, and not just, forward on or click things that they see online, that you don't know where it comes from. So yeah, actually make sure you're genuinely engaging with the Tibet movement and legitimate organizations, and going to the source of this, which is of course DalaiLama.com, the Dalai Lama's office. Yeah.
And that's particularly challenging when the source of that fake statement came from a page that was titled Free Tibet Movement. So to a cursory internet user who's just having a scroll and this pops up, on first glance, that does look legitimate. So there is an extra onus on Tibetans and people who support Tibet to be that much more discerning online, and to be extra careful with their engagement.
Yeah, and like just to say something on the fake statement, right? And that's also like, and I was saying like, and I don't want to use this word again and again, but like the whole aspect of cognitive warfare, this is exactly like this, right? Because it actually alludes to the fact that like there was nothing there, but kind of like trying to say something else. So making sure that people are looking at that from a different perspective, right? And that letter, even like it copied from the original, but if you look at like the wordings on that, it is very similar to how a lot of high-powered individuals have actually used themselves to distance from Epstein. Very similar, like saying like, or interactions on behalf, there was no links. So it is like a standard like media template that people have used. So then like people are questioning that, right? So then you're like, oh, is this a standard media template that's being used? So a lot of these, I think, is part of how cognitive like warfare is being run right now, to really kind of like make people think in different ways. And I do feel like that's something that they've been focusing on in the recent times.
At the end of our interviews on Tibet Unfiltered, we ask our guests for their top 3 facts about Tibet or Tibetans.
First is like Tibet is an independent country, which is backed both by international law and Chinese documents. Because if you look at like, if you read Michael Van Wall's Tibet Brief 2020 and Professor Lau's Tibet was never part of China since antiquity. So these two books, I think, really talk about Tibet's independent status. Second thing is Tibetan government in exile, or the Central Tibetan Administration, is a legitimate representative of Tibetans inside and outside Tibet, and it's recognized by both Tibetans inside as well as outside. And thirdly, the most important thing I think for me as a Tibetan is like His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the bond that connects Tibetans everywhere, both inside and outside, and Tibetans inside Tibet as well. And this is also why such campaigns by the CCP are always targeting His Holiness to malign that bond and trying to really, and they have not been successful. For example, like when they're trying to do this, and this is like an example when they were, the whole thing about the 2023 like aspect, that incident that we were talking about, right, where it was about the cultural center. The Chinese government basically allowed that information to go into Tibet, right? They actually opened up social media to share that. People inside Tibet were so happy that they were able to see His Holiness. So it got the completely opposite reaction. So they can never really destroy the bond. And I think that's something that the CCP really needs to know, because I think this is also part of their strategy.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And thank you, Dr. Zoe Bedford and Lobsang Gyatso Sitha. Thank you both for joining us on Tibet Unfiltered.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for a great conversation.
Tibet Unfiltered is a podcast by the Australia Tibet Council, a not-for-profit human rights organisation. We amplify the voices of Tibetans, campaign for their freedom and human rights, and ensure the international community hears their stories against Chinese Communist Party propaganda. I'm your host, Geraldine Nordfeldt. Production by Sonam Gyeltsen. Join us again soon for another episode of Tibet Unfiltered.